And it's a tremendous opportunity to really find a way to prioritize human interaction, which is counterintuitive when you think about AI, because you think about AI and interacting with artificial intelligence, right? So I guess the way to position it is we're working on a continuum of artificial intelligence at one end of the continuum and human intelligence at the other end of the continuum. And how do we create space for us to use those emerging technologies in such a way that allow us to spend more time building human connection, building community?
In a time when public education systems across Canada are navigating demographic shifts, mental health crises, and profound implications of AI, it's easy to lose sight of the deeper reasons we choose this work in the first place. But every so often, you meet a leader who brings it all back into focus, someone whose journey, values, and voice remind you why education matters. Dr. Christopher Fuzessy is one of those leaders. Now Superintendent of Schools and Chief Education Officer for Foothills School Division in Alberta, Chris brings more than 3 decades of experience to the table. From his early years in studying Indigenous communities in northern Quebec to his current work of embedding flourishing, community, and human connection at the core of a division-wide strategic plan. In today's episode, we explore what it means to lead with purpose in complex times. Chris shares his personal story from delivering pizzas and fixing golf carts to earning a PhD in Indigenous education, and how those early detours shaped his empathy as an educator. We discuss what great classrooms might look like, why trust and transparency are essential at the systems level, and how we might finally begin to scale the kinds of learning environments that light students up. We also talk about the difference between real community and performative connection, why school leaders need gut checks and a culture of psychological safety, how Chris is using AI not to replace teachers, but to free them up to do the most human work, why workplace well-being isn't about yoga or perks, but purpose, relationships, and feeling seen, and how his own writing and book, Emanate, helped him integrate leadership, wellness, and identity into a practice that he can model for others. Chris's vision for education is grounded, systemic, and hopeful. It's the kind of leadership that refuses to lose sight of the people at the heart of the work, especially the students. And it's the kind of conversation that I'm proud to share. So without further ado, here's my interview with Christopher Fuzessy. Chris Fuzessy, welcome to the Education Matters podcast. Where does this podcast find you today?
I'm just south of Calgary in the county of Foothills in Alberta, beautiful part of the world, Treaty 7 territory, and would like to acknowledge the land of the many nations who have lived here generationally over the millennia, the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Tsuut'ina Nation, and the ERA Nakota Nation, as well as the Métis Nation of Alberta.
Thank you, sir, for that land acknowledgement. Always important. How about your generations? Are you from that area? Your family from where you live and work now?
No, I'm not. I'm a Montreal born and raised person from Quebec. Spent most of my life there, with the exception of a trip out to Jasper when I was taking a gap year between college and university. I spent 9 months there and I guess got a taste of the West and always wanted to come back and live in proximity to the mountains. But nope, I'm not a Westerner by heritage, if you will, but transplanted here to Alberta 7 years ago to take on this work.
Wonderful. Have they converted you from being a Habs fan, or is that just ingrained?
No, absolutely not. Still a Habs fan.
Okay.
Though I will latch on to any Canadian team who makes it deep into the playoffs, including the Blue Jays. So yeah.
Fair enough. So we are aligned there.
Yeah.
Chris, tell us a bit about yourself. What was it like growing up? Where and when you grew up?
Well, grew up in the West Island of Montreal, and if you've ever flown into Montreal, when you land at that airport, we lived across the highway essentially from that airport as I grew up. always in proximity to the airport, funnily enough. Not that that's played any kind of role in my life. The West Island was primarily, I guess, an English enclave, if you will, in the Quebec context. Over the years, it has remained so, but to a lesser extent. I worked in the school system that I was educated in, though there was a change in Quebec probably about 30 years ago where they moved from Catholic and Protestant school boards to non-secular English and French school boards. But went back and worked in the systems that I had been educated in, and it was a great place to grow up. Friends, spend a lot of time out in the fields and the undeveloped lands, as many of us did of my era. Came home when the street lights came on, or you heard your parents whistle. Great group of friends growing up as a kid. And yeah, I guess it helped shape me into who I am today.
What are some of your earliest memories when it comes to learning something that really attracted your attention and your wonder?
I remember, environments more than particularly situations of learning. I remember being very happy in kindergarten and loving going there every day. Kindergarten is full time, if you will, 5 days a week, or was when I was a youngster. And I just remember enjoying the environment of curiosity. Seeing new things, learning new things. Those things I don't remember in detail, but the environment. I can remember the classroom had windows facing south, kind of in a semicircular way, and we would sit at the carpet and, we would listen and we would read and interact with one another, and it was just a happy space. When I project forward, I would say my grade 6 classroom was quite similar. It faced north over the schoolyard, and it was a nice place to be. A sense of camaraderie, if you will, comes back to me. I was a little less engaged in high school. So it was more the social relationships, I would say, that drew me to school on a daily basis than the educational part of it. But I will say my grade 11 teacher was pivotal. In Quebec, you graduate in grade 11. So it was my graduating year, pivotal in, I guess, tapping into that curiosity that used to be in elementary school and kind of reinvigorating it and instilling a renewed sense of belief that I could achieve what I set my mind to after that more or less disengaged period earlier in high school.
And what subject did that teacher teach?
Given I was educated in French, so it was English language arts was the subject itself. As individuals who went to French schools, there was a class of English as a second language, if you will, though many of us, it was our first language. But this was kind of beyond English as a second language, and it was literature and poetry and, the study of the English language and what it could offer beyond the mechanics and the grammar of it. So there's a lot of exploration in that course in terms of, I guess, developing capacity to perhaps be creative through the medium of the English language.
Did you always expect to go to university? Did you think that was your path, or was that developed later in high school?
It probably developed after high school. When I finished high school, I went to college. It's called CEGEP in Quebec. It's kind of a 2-year pre-university environment where you can explore, health sciences, social sciences, broader topics, if you will, before you look at something more specific in university. And I ended up parting ways with that college after the first semester. I didn't really attend too much, wasn't engaged, and worked for 2 or 3 or 4 years in many different capacities. I delivered pizza. I worked in restaurants. I overhauled aircraft parts. I took a small engines mechanic course. I worked at golf courses fixing the various machines that tend to the course and cut the grass and whatnot. And it was through that period, I do remember distinctly driving home from work one day at 4:30, 5 o'clock in the evening and thinking to myself, I don't know that I want to do this, cycle through different jobs for the next 40 years. And that was when I applied to go back to CEGEP, and through that second CEGEP experience, determined that education might be a good spot for me.
Now, that's really interesting. It's really been a common theme that a lot of the district leaders across the country did not have education as the first thing they did, either at a high school or university. It's something that, dare I say, called to them at some point later on.
Yeah, I mean, I could add to that story a little bit. The calling wasn't necessarily to be a classroom teacher. It was a means through which I would make my way to Southeast Asia and teach in Japan or China or Korea. Many opportunities still exist for teachers to go to Southeast Asia. Having said that, during my bachelor's degree in teaching English as a second language, which fit with that plan to move on into teaching overseas, I was encouraged by a professor who said, you are excelling at what you're studying, more or less. It's not an exact quote because that was several years ago. Have you ever considered a master's? And so, given someone felt I had that capacity, I thought I would try that. That's where I met my wife, and never ventured to Southeast Asia nor taught anywhere overseas.
Oh, really?
Went from the master's into the PhD, had a couple of daughters, built a family, built a house, finished the PhD, and taught in a local high school. And I guess through all of those experiences, one of the I guess the memories I hold the most is walking into a classroom, or hold the most closely is walking into a classroom after our first daughter was born, and I'd been off for a week. And I had a shift in how I saw the classroom. I didn't see the classroom as a group of students who were, my responsibility to educate. I saw them as other people's children. And the depth of care that I felt for my own child and all three of my children, because we do have three children, understood that parents are sending their kids into our care. And they feel the same way that I do about my kids. And what an awesome responsibility that becomes when that lens shifts. Many people maybe have that realization immediately going into teaching. Mine happened a little bit later on.
No, actually, when I started teaching elementary school, my mom said that to me. She was a veteran of, I think she had just retired at the time, 39 years as a elementary school teacher. And I was describing her some of the frustrations and some of the struggles. And she said, there's a part of this that you can't understand yet because you haven't had kids. I was a better teacher after I had kids. And that's not to say that you can't be a great teacher if you don't have kids. But there's what I understood afterwards, after I had my kids, is the vulnerability that parents feel when their kids go off to school when they're just 6 years old. And that kind of responsibility to honor that vulnerability for the parent and for the child, and to do the best on the parent's side as well as the child's side to make them feel comfortable, loved, welcome, and to have that great introduction. So I really resonate with that as well.
Yeah, it's sorry, just to I guess add a little bit to that. I worked when our daughter was going into kindergarten. I had become a vice principal at that point, and worked within that leadership team, that larger organization, and still followed the bus to the school that morning because as you said, that sense of vulnerability of sending your kids into the care of other adults. I certainly believed in the organization and the services that we provided, being part of it, but still had to follow the bus and, watch her get off and walk into the school. So yeah, I don't know that ever goes away to some degree.
Yeah, I heard somebody, it may have been a movie, my memory's getting worse these days, but I heard somebody once describing having children as having your heart outside your body.
Right.
And that's always what I think of when I see them still to this day. going outside. And so I think that was the point that my mom was making, was that that kind of emotional vulnerability is something that is different, I think, when you're a parent.
Mm-hmm.
Can I ask you, just out of curiosity, what was your master's and your PhD in?
While I was doing my master's, and actually through my bachelor's as well, I worked for an organization called Kativik School Board, and they provide educational services to the Inuit communities of northern Quebec. And so I was working in the South, which was why I was able to study at the same time. And I worked, I think the official title was Student Life Animator. And so there was a residence for first year college or CEGEP students who would come down from the various communities in northern Quebec. And, I'd be there accessible to assist them with, adapting, if you will, if they hadn't spent a lot of time in the South, but also primarily to help them with their studies. So through that experience, to answer your question, in my master's, I looked at what does that journey of coming from northern communities into the South to take on college studies look like? And the title of that dissertation was more or less, it was 25 years ago, so maybe I have this wrong in a word or two, but biculturalism and post-secondary Inuit education. And then I went on to kind of look at that theme from a different lens in my PhD, and worked with an individual who had a lot of, research, knowledge, and expertise in second language education, named Jim Cummins out of the University of Toronto, and looked at it from a teacher lens. I wanted to see, using a conceptual framework that he developed, Minority Student Empowerment Framework was the title of it. What is the impact of a non-Indigenous or a non-Inuit teacher in an Inuit community? Intentional or not, largely subconscious, the results demonstrated that it can have a negative impact. We all carry our cultural biases with us. Not that it was intentional on anyone's part. So, yeah, it was looking at specifically education in northern Quebec and Inuit communities. But I guess, a layer up at the time, what was called Aboriginal education, which we now refer to more respectfully as Indigenous education, was the topic. But empowering students was another subtopic that's always been, I guess, a curiosity of mine and has been woven into the work that I've done since.
Fascinating. I didn't know this about your background. Did you spend a lot of time in northern communities, Indigenous schools?
Well, yes and no. When I was, I think, in grade 5, my uncle was the principal in a town called Kuujjuaq, which is just at the base of Ungava Bay, if you're looking at a map of Quebec. And my aunt was a teacher there. And so I went and spent, I don't recall how it played out, but just after Christmas, I went up there and spent 6 months living with them in that community. Must have left some kind of impact over time on me. During my studies, I did go up to a couple of northern communities, did a replacement teacher contract one spring after the university session had concluded, and also went up to a week-long symposium that was organized by the school board, and participated and talked with community members from across northern Quebec. So I've spent significant time there, but not in any kind of teaching capacity outside of that contract.
What, in your experience, what would you suggest are some of the main things? Bit of a sloppy way of asking the question, but the general things that teachers from, mainly, white and kind of affluent cities really need to understand about Indigenous education and Indigenous communities?
I think the last word you used is a great place to start: community. There is a sense of community that is different from my experience in those northern communities, Inuit communities. There's an interconnectedness element and a sharing element that we don't necessarily see as much of, I would say, because it's present in the South. It's present in cities. It's just harder to find because you need to go to a point of contact, a community center, an arena. That's where you find people coming together. Whereas in a small community of 150 or 300 people, everyone knows one another, supports one another, takes care of one another. And understanding that and understanding how the life is woven into the land. I remember hearing a lot when I was living with those students as a student life animator. We're going out on the land. The land really has a significant impact that I understood from my non-Indigenous perspective on the culture, on the community. Community freezers, for example, where you would put part of the hunt into that freezer for those who may not have the means at that moment or the ability to go out and hunt, so that everyone is taken care of. I think that would be it. Community, deep sense of community that we don't necessarily experience to the same degree when we're living in a city.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot to learn in terms of that last point you made too about the Indigenous kind of ways of knowing and thinking and the connection to the land. That's obviously something that modern Western society has lost, and we're ravaging our ecosystems.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's. You see evidence, or I shouldn't say evidence. I'm not an expert in that field by any means, but you see examples. If we make it specific to the northern part of Canada, the caribou herds are not once what that didn't come out right, are not what they once were. Climate change, melting, all of those things contributing to a different environment and adapting, perhaps, or the necessity to adapt to that.
Yeah. So Chris, either in your experiences in teaching in Indigenous learning about Indigenous communities, or teaching in Montreal or in Alberta, can you describe some of the most inspiring things you've seen as an educator or as a leader?
Yeah, I can. I've been to 2 Canadian student leadership conferences, and that's high school students from across Canada, from all the provinces and territories who come together. And I remember attending one in Lloydminster probably around 2004 or so. I was a vice principal at the time. And I came out of that experience with, frankly, renewed hope for our future. So many bright, enthusiastic, caring, kind, full of energy, contributing to their own school communities in different ways through leadership programs and, creating activities that students could take part in, in a way building community locally within their school context, but bringing that mass of 700 different individuals into a room. The energy was unbelievable. I went to one in Fredericton as well a number of years later, and it was the same experience. So that was quite inspiring. Often in the work that we do, we have meetings, we solve challenges that are before us. We are confronted sometimes with the 1 or 2% of things that aren't necessarily that inspiring and invigorating. So to see an example like that, it kind of brings you back to the purpose of what we do in creating futures, or creating opportunities for people to reach their potential and have a positive impact on the future. So those 2 conferences were one of those moments of inspiration. The other, maybe it's the other end of the continuum away, because it isn't an example that I'll provide, that's big, that involves a lot of people. It's those small moments that you witness when you're out in schools and you walk by classrooms, or you visit classrooms, or you talk with parents, and the care is probably the best way to put it. that teachers have for kids, circling back to what we were saying about other people's children, right? And that level of care and attention to detail to create environments where every student has an opportunity to thrive. And the amount of time and effort that goes into that outside of the school day per se. I see it all the time when I'm out in schools and having conversation with parents and other shareholders in the system, that what drives a great many educators is creating that environment where the spark lights up and it's in that student's eyes, and you go above and beyond in order to provide those opportunities for them. So from a really big example of a conference to the little moments where people are attended to and taken care of by the educators that surround them. It's inspiring. I mean, it brings me back every day.
Yeah, I mean, it's always one of the things I love to do, and you're going to be a participant at our upcoming summit, where half of the programming is school visits, essentially, because right. I think too many times we talk about education in conference halls, and we don't talk about it in the context of what's happening right here and now. So I love that kind of work and love seeing that. On that note, what are some of the characteristics of great classrooms? What do they look like, sound like, feel like when you're visiting them?
They look and feel vibrant. And that doesn't necessarily mean that there are things on the wall. I was not a teacher who had a lot of, posters or things of that nature or quotes. I had a radio and a plant. And that was about it. But, I probably
you were
could have
ahead
done
of
much,
the whole,
much better.
You were ahead of the whole minimalist vibe.
Yeah. I will say that, when I talk with pre-service teachers here at the University of Calgary, I tell them that they're all better teachers than I ever was. But it's that sense of vibrancy and energy, right? So part of that can be the environment. And since I've left the classroom, universal design and different lighting and different seating and things of that nature, I see a lot of that when I'm out in classes across our system here. But it's more the intangible energy that's created that you can tell whether it's a quiet space because kids are working on individual projects or in small groups, or it's a more boisterous space. That positive energy where students are engaged, where teachers are acting as facilitators. They are teaching at times, of course, but facilitating that learning and I guess encouraging the curiosity that students have to engage with that curricular topic. That's what I see, and that's what I feel is a sense of engagement, a sense of vibrancy, and a positive energy in that classroom setting where curiosity comes to the forefront. And, there's a fail forward attitude. Not that, that's by design, but if you don't get it the first time, it's okay. You can go back and relearn and or attempt again if it's some kind of, construction-based activity. We need to learn to develop that capacity to not necessarily be successful the first time. I mean, I'd look at my pathway in education, and I certainly wasn't successful at points in my career, and that's okay because you can come back, you can overcome, you can try again, and you can define yourself differently over time. So that's what I see, sense, and feel, and what gives me that sense of inspiration and awe when I leave a classroom.
If we can now turn to, keep that example in mind, but now put on our system leader lens and think about how we can make what you just described more of the norm than it is. It has always frustrated me to no end to go to Alberta, go to BC, go to the Maritimes and see amazing things happen here in Ontario, of course. And it's so amazing, but even in the district itself that I'm seeing it's in relatively small pockets. in your work as a system leader, and maybe this is a way to talk about some of your like strategic planning and thinking. Like, what are the things that leaders need to do to continue to encourage that kind of classroom dynamic at scale?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's ongoing work. To be honest with you, there's a couple of things. I think one of the fundamental pieces is looking at building an environment and a culture in the organization, if I can put it that way, where there is transparency for sure, but a deeper understanding of what our shared purpose is, and an ability to communicate about that. The various iterations over every school division I've worked in or talked to about, the ivory tower, the division office, head office disconnected from the schools. How do you dispel that to the greatest degree possible is to be present, to be in schools, to engage in conversation with people across the system. And we've looked at, a variety of ways to do that over time that have had impact, but that we've also shuffled out because we realized that their impact, wasn't necessarily sustainable, not from the standpoint of we could keep it happening, but it was something that we tried, that we learned from, that then we moved on to different things. And I'll speak a little bit more specifically about that in a second. But what I think that generates outside of shared purpose is trust. Trust that you can share your opinion. Trust that if you see a topic differently than a decision that's been made, that you can reach out and you can have a conversation. And, we need to be humble and self-reflective enough as leaders to be able to change our minds when we're given information that we didn't necessarily seek out or consider or wasn't available to us. The literature on organizational psychology calls that psychological safety. And when I started my answer and I said it's ongoing work, I've said this to our team here more than probably 10 or 15 times. Trust is not a checkbox, right? You don't, okay, well, we've done some great work here. We've developed trust, check. Now we can move on to developing something else, something that we need to attend to consistently, constantly. And I think that reflective practice is a key to doing that. And I call it the gut check. If I receive feedback, positive or negative, I need to think through that and understand if I could have done it better. And I've said most recently too, and I've shared this with the team many times, if ever I lose that gut check, it's time to leave because I won't be doing the job to the best of my ability. So some of those structures, like I send something out every Monday morning called the 5-day forecast, which includes my schedule for the week. It includes a quote that I read a lot. So, a quote from a book that I'm reading, what I think that makes me, or how it affects the work, how it influences the work. I invite people to engage with that. Talk about my resilience meter. How am I feeling? None of us show up 100% of the time. And acknowledging that, I think, gives space tacitly for people to realize that, they can also be in a less than perfect space sometimes. And I talk a lot too about how do we support one another and what's our shared purpose. We've had Ask the Superintendent Anything buttons on our portal, and that worked well for a while, but people stopped engaging with it after a while. We go out and have superintendent advisory sessions. Anyone across the system can come in and talk to us about what's on their mind. We try to actively engage with people, I guess, to create and build that culture. And the other piece is vision. What is the vision that we're striving towards? So our vision here at Foothill School Division is engagement, support, and success for each learner. We distilled that down a little bit, though, and we talked about placing education at the center of a flourishing community as our organizational purpose. If you talk to people who work here and you mention the word flourish, they'll be familiar with it to the point where, people have said to me at times, flourish is the Foothills F word. which,
it's a good F word to have.
yeah, it's good to have, but it tells me that it's reached. It's gone out there and it's had reach, right? But it's also a difficult one to achieve. Flourishing is mutual, right? So we don't flourish in isolation. And that's part of the reason we went in that direction. What we've been talking about this year is community, with unity capitalized, because there's unity in communities. So how do we create that? And, as I'm saying this, I'm thinking about the earlier parts of our conversation. I see the influences that have kind of led me to this place, and putting that out there this year and seeing how we continue to build community. And I think, in all the reading I've done and the work I've done here in the last 6 years and into this year, that I can't unsee, I can't unthink. I firmly believe that it's our responsibility as public education systems to create a sense of community, and to continue to strive towards that. There are varying beliefs, varying perspectives. Our Safe and Caring Schools policy is a place for all. We can all coexist with those varying beliefs and perspectives, and create that space for kids to be able to flourish. It can be a challenge on any given day, but that's our North Star.
So you and I met through the wonderful Gina Cherkowski and her amazing mental health summit in Banff earlier this year.
Yeah.
And it's evident that mental health and well-being is central to your work. Can you describe for the leaders listening that may have not prioritized it yet in the way you have, what that's like and how it's part of the overall flourishing narrative that you're working on in the district?
Yeah, we wove it into, and I don't want to give you the impression that it wasn't work already being done here before I arrived, because it was. So this wasn't something new per se. Alberta at the time had been moving in the direction of looking at workplace wellness through a partnership that College of Alberta School Superintendents had with, I think it's the McConnell Foundation, based out of Montreal. But it became more of an area of emphasis, I guess, when I got here. I spent the first 6 months or so visiting every school, every principal, vice principal, talking with parents, talking with teachers, and trying to understand where they wanted the system to go. And it was a theme that came out, which was great, because it was a theme that I had wanted to bring to the organization. And so we've done a lot of work on workplace wellness and student well-being. So it's in our education plan, which is our strategic plan. And it's got a few strategic plans attached to it from a student perspective and from a staff perspective. And so, one of the things I've learned about all of that work is, I'll give you an example. I guess 2 years into that work, of course, there was a pandemic happening at the time, which certainly didn't help anyone's wellness or well-being. But sentences such as, well, I don't think we should do this because it's not good for my wellness or my well-being. I remember saying at some professional learning that we maintained that we need to stay true to our purpose. We're a learning organization. We're going to continue to learn to the extent that we possibly can during that time, right? So what I learned from that is that wellness and well-being are very personal. And it's the organization's responsibility to put systems and structures in place for people to opt in where they feel comfortable, where they see merit. It's not about a yoga program, though that may be very meaningful for some. It's not about a CrossFit program. It's about opening up the conversation about how are you doing. It's about supporting one another. And also understanding that some people don't necessarily want to talk about that, which is okay. But that doesn't mean you can't check in on those people when they seem like they're not having the best day possible, and, say, hey, colleague, how you doing today? You don't necessarily need to talk about it, but, if you need help, I'm here. So we've opened that conversation up more broadly. And we've got a group called Staff Advisory Council that comes together 3 or 4 times a year and talks about the topic of workplace well-being. And there's a person from each school and department that's represented that brings those conversations back to the local school or point of service. And, really emphasizing what supports are available through our employee benefit program and things of that nature, so that people do feel comfortable to reach out. And what we've seen is a higher usage rate And those providers are asking us, well, what are you doing in order to get higher usage rates? Because they seem to hover around 3 or 4% nationally, where we're up, I think, in the 9 or 10% range. So it's fundamentally important, I guess, to get back to the gist of your question. In my mind, it's fundamentally important that we as leaders, as teachers, as support staff, as bus drivers, those of us who are interacting with children are as well as possible. Because if we're as well as possible, we'll give the most possible that we can for them to succeed academically and also feel a sense of place and a sense of belonging, and increase their wellness.
Yeah, I know you're on a journey here along, a continuum in supporting this work. Do you have any at least indicators or evidence, if I dare use that word, that suggests this is having impact in terms of teacher leave and teacher, absenteeism? I don't know if absenteeism is the right term, but I think you know what I mean.
Yeah, I do. A couple of years ago, we were in a situation where our enrollment is declining slightly. Actually, this year it might actually go up a little bit. But with that, because of just how funding formulas work, there's a decline in budget that comes along with that. Mm-hmm. And I remember having a conversation a few years ago as we were finalizing budget and saying, at what point do we reinvest in the system and take a chance that by, maybe moving money from a different area, for example, maybe we evergreen a few less laptops this year, which, every teacher needs in the system, and we put a little bit more money into the teaching side of things. Is there a tipping point, I guess? Because we'd seen leaves increasing, I think, along with the rest of the country following the pandemic. And at what point do we invest? And so anyway, we did, and put a little bit more budget towards shoring up human resources to the greatest extent possible. And we did see a decline in leaves. We did see a decline in absenteeism in the years that followed. And it's they're difficult conversations to have. Not that I begrudge it. I wanted the job, so that comes along with the job, right? But they're difficult conversations to have about, because it's a risk. It's a theoretical risk to invest and see what the outcomes are. But we did see positive outcomes from that decision. And every year when we budget, we consult with community and with our whole staff team. And every year thus far, it's been frontline resources. And so it certainly aligns with what our community wants to see. And so we've maintained that over the years, and seen results. Not that they don't fluctuate a little bit up, a little bit down at times, but positive results. The other concrete data that we have is the Guarding Minds at Work survey, which I think comes out of the University of Guelph. And the EdCan network has now developed a comparator for Canadian public school systems. And so we did that, I think in 2020 we did it, and then we did it again last year. And, the results aren't necessarily markedly improved, but there's a consistent thematic in a few areas in our larger staff team, because every employee had opportunity to complete it. And we've had, I think, 85% completion rates plus in both instances. But balance is an issue. Workload is an issue. And workplace well-being is an issue. So, we can't, not that I'm suggesting we will or have talked about it, but we can't abandon this work of workplace well-being, because these are the three predominant factors that people are challenged with in our larger system. On the upside, when we compare ourselves to the Canadian norm, we are doing a little bit better. Not that that's something we want to trumpet from the rooftops. We're not as bad but
yeah, this work certainly takes time, and I know you're continuing to pursue that in the work you're doing personally as well, which is what I want to turn to in just a minute. But I also wonder what connections you can draw here too, but I want to ask you about some of the work that you and the district are doing around AI.
Yeah.
I've had, dozens of conversations at this point about the impact of AI on education, and I think those of us that are willing to really look at it know that it's going to significantly impact the day-to-day teaching and learning. But from what I understand about what you're doing at Foothills, it's actually quite innovative from all the different folks I've talked to. Can you just generally describe where your work started and what it looks like, and
Yeah.
what you're hoping to grow it into?
Yeah, I can trace this back. A few summers ago, we were traveling as a family to visit family back east, and received a text message from someone more or less saying, "Hey, have you seen this AI thing? Like, what are your thoughts on it?" And that really prompted me to research. As I said, I read a lot, so I needed to kind of learn more about the history of AI. So I read a few kind of seminal texts about AI and its history, and a couple too that predicted maybe it could go wrong. But what I drew from it is that this is a tremendous opportunity, and it's a tremendous opportunity. And this kind of guided our work here at the division to really find a way to prioritize human interaction, which is counterintuitive when you think about AI, because you think about AI and interacting with artificial intelligence, right? So I guess the way to position it is we're working on a continuum of, artificial intelligence at one end of the continuum and human intelligence at the other end of the continuum. And how do we create space in that continuum for us to use those emerging technologies in such a way that allow us to spend more time building human connection, building community? So some of the things that we've done from that lens, one of the first decisions we made was we didn't want to opt into, I'll call it prepackaged AI platforms. We didn't want to have to purchase something. So we worked within our own domain in Microsoft 365 and started leveraging our possibilities within that domain, primarily two reasons. One, budget. Two, there's a safeguarding of data in that way. We're not interacting in a platform that transfers data over the larger net, if you will, and safeguarding our data. So we've built a number of tools internally that use AI to help us with processes. Most recently, for example, over the summer, there's some new curriculum being rolled out here in Alberta. So we use that as an opportunity to use our emerging understanding of AI and the different tools and platforms that we can build with it to generate curricular content. So you think about that, new curriculum, developing lessons, mapping out our approach as a system to assist our teachers in rolling that out the following year. That's a lot of time and effort if you take technology out of the equation. But by leveraging AI and controlling the data that goes in to building those lessons, so it has to be Alberta-based curriculum. What is our instructional approach here? And we have a learning that transfers approach. So critical inquiry, learner agency, living with complex problems over time. And you put that into this tool and it generates lessons for you in a matter of minutes. Then we spend our time as the experts in education, teachers, predominantly, who spent a couple of weeks in the beginning of July doing this, fine-tuning that. Does this fit? Does it truly work, right? You don't generate something and send it out sight unseen. You spend your time really fine-tuning and creating a opportunity for relationship to be built with those individuals. B, a deep sense of connection to the material to be able to then champion it when we send it out. And C, actually spend time in that area of passion, if you will, or that concept of flow, as opposed to the, I might be dramatic by design here, but the drudgery of building it up to that point, right? And then maybe being, a little bit less passionate about, okay, well, we got this far, now we got to, do the final push. So that's really been our emphasis, is how do we leverage the tools? How do we create tools that will take the guesswork out and then let people spend their time in that place of fine-tuning, passion. Another example is we took all our APs, our administrative procedures and policies, and our guiding documents, and we created something called the FSD Assistant. And so, for example, I'll use a pretty trite example. There's a larvae infestation in the lawn at the school. What do you do about it? Well, you throw that question into that tool. It lists the different administrative procedures, who to call, and what you should do in that instance in order to, address that problem. It's pretty trite, but you can take that to the other end of the continuum.
Yeah, sure.
Student arrives with a concussion or has hurt themselves on the playground. What are my next steps if you're a brand new vice principal? Well, that can guide you at least in those initial steps, and usually cues you in to talk to the principal or myself, and we work it out in the best interest of that student. But that's where we've put our time and effort.
Well, I love it because you're really modeling kind of, the kind of experimentation that is necessary to understand where this impacts a school district. And I love that a big part of the focus has been on the administrative side, right? Like you're actually exploring it to solve problems that you and your colleagues on the administrative side have that, create all kinds of unnecessary burden. Hopefully, at least playing with tools like this, you might eventually arrive at solutions where, I can imagine what it was like for a principal before to find out how to deal with, larvae in the lawn, right? Like, who do you call? Where do you start? What's going on here? My kids just want to play soccer on the field, right? So I think that's a real cool example. If I can ask you quickly to give some, recommendations to district leaders that are listening, like where do they start with this? Someone hears this and like, wow, that's a cool idea. Where would you recommend they begin?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I started with deepening my own understanding and knowledge about it because that's how I learn. So I guess part of the answer to that question is, where is your comfort zone? How do you learn? How can you immerse yourself step by step into that new learning in a way that's familiar to you?
Push that zone, right?
Yeah,
and push that zone because it's not going to be comfortable learning about these AI systems and the implications for education. That's for sure.
No, and I guess the other thing I would say there is, it's not necessarily where do I start, but keep in mind, or I would suggest that people keep in mind that, we've seen examples of this before in our work in education. Google, for example, iPads, they don't go away. Right. So the earlier we adopt and we understand and we start experimenting and weaving that into instruction, the better off we will be. And our students are going to be experiencing changes like this with respect to artificial intelligence well into their futures. And so it would be irresponsible in my mind not to work in that direction and find ways to help them understand, but also to help them teach us to a certain extent, because many of our youth, particularly in high schools and junior high, are probably more conversant with these technologies than many of us who were a little longer in the tooth, if you will. The other thing I'll say, though, to go back to your original question, because I should have said it earlier, if I may, is the year that, that summer I talked about getting that text message about AI, we have an opening day here where the whole employee team comes together. So all 800 or 900 of us, and it's a privilege to be able to bring everyone together and share a common message to start a school year. Well, I talked about AI a little bit, and what that did was gave tacit permission for those teachers or educators out there who are interested to begin experimenting within that, SharePoint or M365 Copilot environment. So we've got teachers who have done wonderful things, created tutors for their own students that they can access at any time, right? So it's happening here, but it's also happening out in the system, which there's a bit of a convergence when you bring those two areas of experimentation and innovation together.
Wonderful, Chris. And I know you and I can talk, and I'd love to maybe at a future time talk about what those experiences are looking like and where you're going next with that. But I do want to spend some time talking about a really interesting book that you've written called Emanate. Can you
Yeah.
give the audience a brief description of the book and why you wrote it?
Yeah, it's difficult to it's difficult to describe the book because it isn't a particular genre, if you will. It's part leadership, it's part mental health, it's part well-being, it's part community, and it's steeped throughout in self-reflection. And the reason I wrote it, it kind of wrote itself. It was a necessary process. It's probably the best way to put it for me to write that book, because I was wrestling with all of those topics and trying to make sense of them. And writing is, I guess, a place I've always felt a little bit of comfort. And so I gravitated towards that in this process to create this work. And I guess the thing I wrestled with more so, it wasn't difficult to write, though it took several iterations and fine tuning and editing and all of those things. The decision I wrestled with more was whether or not to make it public, because it is so self-reflective. But the process itself, I guess, that I engaged in taught me that if this can be helpful to someone else, then I wouldn't be honoring the process if I didn't actually put it out there, if you will. So, yeah.
So, like in the book, you argue that healing, well-being, strong leadership are really possible for everyone. Mm-hmm. For leaders that feel, far from that possibility, what would you suggest as a first step for them?
I think through self-reflection, aligning your values with those of the organization, where possible. I talk at one point in the book about sometimes we need to make a decision to move on because that might be best for, that alignment process. At the heart of public education is, encouraging students to reach their potential and creating a sense of belonging. Those are the two, I guess, fundamental pieces, and academic success derives from those fundamental pieces, right? So it is not necessarily difficult to find where your values can contribute to that, because we get into this work not because we want to do anything else than create a positive difference. So I think it's that soul searching, reflective piece of, what drives me? How do I get in touch with what truly drives me? And then how do I channel that in my day-to-day? Every job has its share of more difficult, more challenging, non-preferred tasks. But if we can kind of keep our mind focused on, I'm going to get through this meeting and I may not enjoy it, but that's going to get me back to the place where I can channel my purpose and my drive and, have positive influence in the community. It's interesting. There's a space in the book where that concept was introduced to me. Someone said to me, your values drive the organization. And for whatever reason, could it be that I missed the obvious at times? Potentially.
Yeah.
But maybe I was just open to hearing it in that moment. And it was a real mind bender, frankly. Because when you look at that statement, you realize the awesome responsibility that you hold in working in a role, whether that be a classroom teacher role, a principal's role, a bus driver's role, a superintendent's role, right? So we really need to be in tune with who we are and what drives us in order to bring the best we possibly can to create that positive emergent future and community, which I said before earlier in our conversation, I believe is our responsibility as educators.
Well, I am a huge fan of books that don't fit into a genre, so I think other people will really enjoy it as well. To wrap up, Chris, a few questions for you that I love to ask every guest.
Sure.
If you look forward to the future of education, you can put whatever time frame you want on that. What does it look like to you? Give me the good and the bad. And if there's ugly, we can have ugly too.
I'll start with, it's not necessarily good or bad. I think it's just the space we're currently at nationally. in education and public education. And, I work in a couple of different networks with superintendents across Canada, and we all have similar challenges. We're all facing similar things, regardless of whether it's rural, city, urban, regardless of what province it's in. And I start there because I think we're at a nexus point of some sort in public education. And when I think through that, and this leads me to what does the next 50 years look like? What I keep coming back to is, we're in systems that were built and constructed over 100 years ago. We need to have maybe some hard conversations about, do the systems still fit the society as it's evolved to? Public education was, and potentially still can be, what I've heard described over the years as the great equalizer. It gives everyone an opportunity to be literate, to be numerate, to understand, the history of the nation or the province or the world that we live in. It's become intertwined in a way with the work world. It's a great place for kids to go, but it also allows parents to go and work, which is necessary, right? So where are we with the social contract on education, I think is what I'm getting to. Do we need to have a conversation about what that looks like, and how do we redefine these systems in such a way that they continue to serve sustainably and achieve the goals that they were set out to achieve, which is to create that enabling of potential for each individual to be who and what they want to be, and to contribute, civically in a democratic society to continuing to build this nation. Yeah. What that looks like, 50 years out, I think there's a sustainability aspect to it. I think that and schools do this. You see iterations of this across Canada as well. How do we work? How do we learn within our own environments, physical environments? What does that look like from a community sustainability standpoint? I happen to live in a beautiful area where there's lots of agriculture, for example. So what does sustainable agriculture look like in this subsection of the larger province and or the nation that we live in, right? And how do we leverage those things and empower kids to understand and live in those spaces and prepare themselves for the future challenges that will occur, because they've occurred in every generation, and be empowered with the knowledge to be able to do that. I think that's an element of it. And I also think, the only place we have any real influence, if you will, and I'm not sure that's even the right word, is in our local communities. And so we need to really build that sense of local community. And if we can each, I say individually, but I mean individual systems, not individually as a superintendent. If we can each contribute to that, imagine the possibilities of the strength of community across Canada. So I think it's a focus on community. It's a focus on sustainability, and a focus on, continuing to provide a safe, caring and welcoming environment for each individual, which thus sets that foundation for community in the future.
Wonderful vision. My penultimate question is always, if you had a magic wand, what would you do to change the education system?
Wow. You have to give me a moment to reflect on that one.
Yeah, and I can give you some context there. It's an all-powerful wand. It doesn't have to be just your system. We'll ring fence Canada. So how would you change the Canadian education systems with your all-powerful magic wand?
I think my answer to that, Jason, is, there's a lot of expertise in every single school and in every single community across Canada. And I think finding a way to leverage that and share that knowledge and that expertise in a way that creates a shared purpose for developing a positive and emergent future. What we all have in common is humanity, and if we can put that at the center and leverage the expertise that surrounds us, and have the ability to do that, as it I guess the magic wand piece is, can we create a space where that becomes the norm? And if that could become the norm, how empowering would that be for our students and our communities to be able to build together towards that positive emergent future for those students that are in our care and the ones that'll be in their care when they, are the adults who are making the decisions around all of that. So I think that would be it. That's a tough question.
That's beautiful. Yeah, I think it is. I think the reason I ask it is to just strip away, I should say, all the barriers to creating that just society that we know we need to continue and incrementally build. Mm-hmm. That was a wonderful answer, and if I find that wand, I'll hand it over to you.
All right,
Chris. My last question is always, and I'm really looking forward to your answer for this one because you're a reader and a real reader. So it doesn't have to be a book, though, although I know you're going to give me a book. What podcast, book, video, movie, music album have you really enjoyed recently or of all time that you'd recommend to the audience?
Yeah, that's another difficult question to pin it down to one. It will be a book.
name 30. It's fine. It's fine. I love recommendations.
There's a book by a professor at MIT named Otto Scharmer. He wrote a book called Theory U, and it's called Theory U because the theory that he explains, I guess, or works through in his book is U-shaped, and it's about how a committed group of individuals can create positive emergent change, and what does that process look like? He gives lots of examples. For example, when the Berlin Wall came down in the 80s or the 90s, I don't recall, I'm getting too old. When the Berlin Wall came down, what were the precursors? What had to happen in order for that, geopolitical event really to take place and kind of reshape international relations as it did at that time? And so it stayed with me. It's influenced me in my work and in my thinking. And you've heard me talk about positive emergent future a few times, probably, as we talked. Another one is Peter Senge wrote The Fifth Discipline, probably in the late 90s. I think he's also an MIT professor, but it's about systems and systems thinking. And that too has helped me shape and understand the work that I do. Everything is a system, and we all interconnect in some form or fashion. And so having an understanding of systems and how they potentially can function helps us in our leadership work, I believe. And so, that's also had a bit of an impact here. And a final one is a book, I'm forgetting the title now, but I remember the author. It's Robin Wall Kimmerer. And it's a book about Indigenous ways of knowing. And that language that I used before, flourishing, is mutual. Braiding Sweetgrass. I knew it would come back to me if I kept talking. It's called Braiding Sweetgrass. A lot of similarities, if you will, between what she writes about and systems thinking. And so, that quote, flourishing is mutual, comes from Robin Wall Kimmerer. And it kind of just puts in perspective very easily that, none of us live in isolation. Our communities don't live in isolation. And if it's mutual, what can we each do, contribute to the best of our ability to be able to create that flourishing environment or community or classroom or system as a system leader? So those Wonderful. Are some of the most recent ones.
Well, I've written both down, and this one in particular, Braiding Sweetgrass, and the subtitle is Indigenous Wisdom, Scientific Knowledge, and the Teachings of Plants. She's a botanist, and scientist, obviously here, and it says member of First Nation. So, I mean, that looks fantastic, and that is right up my alley. So, thank you, sir, and
you're welcome.
Thank you very much for joining the podcast. This was a pleasure.
I appreciate the opportunity, Jason, and it's nice to take time and reflect. The work can and should take the forefront a lot of the time, but finding those moments of reflection are important because it tunes you back into the purpose and the reason why we're here, trying to create that positive emergent change. So the opportunity is deeply appreciated to have this conversation. Thank you.
This podcast is recorded on the territory and Treaty 13 lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and on the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat and the Haudenosaunee. The show is edited and produced by the marvelous and talented Andrew Mastroianni. If you like what you're hearing, make sure you subscribe to us on Spotify or wherever you listen to your podcast. Until next time, remember, there's absolutely no inevitability as long as there's a willingness to contemplate what's happening. I'm your host, Jason Bucheri. Until next time.